You had a sentence in your book that I thought was maybe the strongest sentence I'd ever seen from a business leader that I was not aware of until I read your book in full, which was you said that you think that the odds of America slipping into a civil war type scenario over the next 10 years is around 30%. And you characterize that as like not that high a risk. I feel like that should be A1 headline news everywhere. And by the way, I'm with you. Like, I agree with you.
Here's what I think is happening and probably will happen. The populism of the left and the right are individuals who are fighters for those constituencies. And there are very different values, very different approaches. What that means is that there's little compromise and there's much greater extremism, very much like happened in Europe. 4 major democracies in the 1930 to 45 period had this type of internal conflict that ended up their parliaments, their legislatures choosing to have autocracies, that they went to autocracies, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain. And if you study history, you see it was the same in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, which are all sort of civil wars. You lose the middle, because you have to say, Andrew, you got to get on one side or another and fight. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And so you see just even people moving from place to place in terms of where they think it's more sympathetic to their way of being and what they're like. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, California moves to Texas and so on. And you're seeing then not as much respect for the Constitution and the legal system, because you have a win at all cost. So, for example, if you have the dispute between, let's say, Disney and the Florida governor, in the past, there would have been almost mutual respect for different points of view. But what you now get back is you get back to a power conflict. Well, what would the odds put? I'll ask you what you think the odds are that, for example, in the next presidential election, that neither side accepts losing. I'd say almost too close to call. And what is the possibility that states do not follow the directions of the Supreme Court decisions? Because the Supreme Court decisions can be viewed by one side as a political decision made by the other Supreme Court, and how do we get around that or whatever, just like sanctuary cities. In other words, I will not follow that rule. And so now you start to have a breakdown of the system, and you have power politics determining things. So I think that kind of civil war is relatively likely.
I don't disagree with you at all, Ray. And anyone who listens to me knows that I've been trying to sound an alarm on this. So one of the things you say in your book is that you think one way out of this is a strong peacemaker, and we pray for them. But you say that that's not something that generally happens, that generally the other thing happens. What I'm trying to do, have you seen any of Catherine Geller or Michael Porter's work on political incentives? Because one of the things that's driving our polarization is that we have these party primaries that disproportionately empower the most extreme 10% of partisan voters. So one thing we're trying to do is change the mechanics of our elections so that it's not just the most extreme hyper partisans choosing our leaders and then reelecting them. Right now, you have 20% of Americans happy with Congress, which is very, very low. But the re-election rate for individual members is 94%, which is astronomically high. But your book talks about the increase in polarization as a precursor to some of these very negative things happening. And there are other societies that have democracies that have more than 2 parties. That's actually the norm in most of the world. And so what we're trying to do at Forward is change the mechanics so that you can have more points of view emerge, and then start a positive unifying third party force that represents the reasonable middle that can draw energy and resources and also put pressure on both of the parties to compromise. I don't know if this is something that you've dug into and explored either in terms of the mechanics of why it seems like we're getting more extreme and polarized leadership, or if there have been other countries that have reformed their way out.
So I think we're completely in agreement. Just going back to the mechanics, I think it has to do fear. I hope that we can understand what the context, what it means to have the type of civil war. What is the probability, and what does that mean? Like I have a principle: if you worry, you don't have to worry, and if you don't worry, you need to worry.
That's a pretty good rule of life.
If you worry, you'll take care of the thing you're worrying about, and you can worry less. And if you don't, then probably it'll kill you. The extremism, which has problems in terms of destroying a system, is a terrible path. Anybody who's gone through this, and I mean it domestically as well as internationally. But the number one thing is that the population has got to want that. And in our two-party system, we have a problem because let's say there's about 30% of the population I would define as being rather extreme right, and maybe something like 15% of the population being extreme left. But as a percentage of their own parties, they're relatively high, and they're gathering more as the fight approaches. And so they become then dominant, and you have that particular result. But the power of the middle, if you can, and the power of also compromise, if you can bring that about, is enormous, because still the majority of people are not in those two. We're talking about 45% of the population maybe is fairly extreme at opposite ends. But the majority still aren't there. And if the majority they have to be smart enough to know how to increase the size of the pie and divide the pie well, to produce equal opportunity and equal and some element of sharing it, to get the balance right.
You wrote a number of pieces in 2018 and 2019 about how we need to try and reform the economy or reform capitalism so that it works for more people. And one of the stats that you cited was a stat that I cited too on the trail, which was that the odds of American children doing better than their parents are down to, let's say, 50-50 and dropping, which is one of the things that's driving people to anger, frustration. I mean, it's very fundamental. You're a parent, I'm a parent. If you felt like your kids are going to do worse than you, then you start looking around being like, okay, what the heck is going wrong?
Yes, I wrote a study which was why and how capitalism needs to be reformed, which was a very controversial study, but it's an obvious fact that if it's not benefiting the majority of the people, okay, then just by its metrics of success, it's not going to be successful. Yep. And reformed doesn't mean gone away with. It means changing certain things. That means it works better, keeping capitalism and so on. Capitalists tend to be people who have new ideas, and if you give them capital and they can invent really good things and improve it, it's a wonderful system. It's been proven by everybody. It's been adopted by the Chinese, Deng Xiaoping, to make a better system. But it has to work in a way where it produces the outcomes that you want. The middle, the problem is capitalists are better able at increasing the pie, but they don't know how to divide the pie well. They don't have to share it well. And socialists don't know how to make it as good a pie, but they divide it well. So I think you need the bipartisan. Like if I was president of the United States, which by the way, I will never be, I'm not running, but I would want to have a bipartisan cabinet. Okay, I'd put a bipartisan cabinet. And I would have the equivalent to a Manhattan Project to think about what reforms need to be made to achieve that. In other words, of the left, of the right, smart, capable, mechanically savvy individuals who know about engineering. And there will have to be structural changes. For example, let's say education. The Constitution makes education, a state issue, which then is in most states become the local tax district issue. I know this well because my wife and I, to some extent, but her really works in the worst school districts in Connecticut. I'll give you a shocking statistic. In Connecticut, which is one of the richest states in the country, 22% of the high school students are either disengaged or disconnected. Disengaged means that their absentee rate is greater than 25%. They're failing classes.
Oh my gosh.
And disconnected means that they don't know where they are because they dropped out of school. 22% of the high school students are
That's
failing high school. Now, there's a cycle there. They're in a poor district. They don't have parents who adequately take care of them and so on. The state of Connecticut spends $600 million a year on incarcerations because there's that. So the notion, like there's no better investment than quality education. But these types of changes, some have to be reformed. Maybe it requires some constitutional amendments, but it certainly means working together because the country or the world as a whole has more resources than it ever had. It has more intelligence than it ever had, but it has a choice. Is it going to go to war, or is it, and which will make things worse than ever, or is it going to try to find a way together to make that better whole? That's the choice I think we face.